They're coming. They're coming. But, you know, my really faithful folk, they all know to sit over here. In the amen section, right? Yes. And the hands raised. In the good morning pastor section. I like it. Oh, man. My axis is tilted. I'm getting the thumbs up from the sound booth, so probably YouTube is hearing all the things I'm saying right now. What do you think I can say real quick to get us demonetized? We're not monetized anyway, so it doesn't matter. I mean, can you imagine if you tuned into church and you started getting ads popping up? Like, that would be weird. We're not doing that. No, we're not doing that. Hey, good morning, class. Buenos días. ¿Cómo estás? ¿Qué tal? Muy bien. Muchas gracias. And he addressed me as usted. Gosh. I said, and you addressed me as usted. Man, I can feel the respect in here. All right. We finished. So if you would please turn with me to Acts chapter 29. All right. No. We finished up Acts last week. And yeah. I hope that's a feeling of accomplishment and not relief. Oh, thank you. Well, we're going to start a new study today. We're going to start on the book of Daniel. There's a little bit of an inflection point about halfway through the book. And I'm going to make a judgment call as we're getting there, whether we do the whole book or just part one. Now, here's the thing. The first half of the book of Daniel is basically narrative. The second half is basically just prophecies. So it's like the book shifts significantly between those two things. And the stuff that I'm most interested in teaching about right now, it's kind of that first half of the book stuff. So we're just going to see how class goes and where we are on the church calendar. And so we may do the whole book, or we may just do the first half and then move on to something else after that. Okay? Is that okay, Joe? All right. Great. I want to point out. No, I don't want to point that out. Calling people out is not necessarily good. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to say that I'm really proud of y'all for showing up. Yeah. Some of y'all got that memo. All right. So, like I said, we're going to start the book of Daniel. Now, Daniel is a prophet, and you get some very familiar stories. Off the top of your head, can you name a story out of the book of Daniel? Lion's Den. First thing that comes to mind. Can you think of a second one? Yeah, the fiery furnace, right? Which Daniel's not in. There was another in the fire, standing next to me. Yeah, so those are two pretty well-known stories. How about another one? Can you think of another one? What's that? Dreams? Yep. That's an important part. There's another one that has evolved into a cultural idiom. When you can tell that the end of something is coming soon, you say that you can see the writing on the wall. That also comes out of the book of Daniel, so we'll get there too. I think a lot of us, when we open up the Gospels, we kind of have an idea where it happens, right? Oh, Roman Empire, there's Caesar, all that kind of stuff. It's in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, pretty much, Galilee, all that kind of stuff. Sometimes these Old Testament books, especially because I don't think we spend as much time on them in our church maybe as we do on New Testament stuff. I always feel like it's good to give you a little bit of context. So to start our class today, I just want to run you through a brief history of the world. But specifically, a brief walk through the Bible. So, where do we start? Can we go here? Cool. I'm going to keep talking. Nothing? I got nothing. You got nothing? I'm on. Interesting. Let me just make sure that's in good. Still nothing? Okay. Check 1, 2. we have levels coming up? Okay. We'll do this and we'll sort that out. I'll try and end a little bit early and we'll sort that out before church. Sound good? All right. Professional polished TV. People are watching at home on YouTube right now. All right, brief history. Where do we start in biblical history? In the beginning, yeah. Very good. So that's so Genesis. That starts with nothing but God, right? Is this marker going to do it? I don't know. We'll see. Adam and Eve. I'm just going to hit some highlights. Noah. Is that not working? All right, Adam and Eve, Noah, and then probably we can go to, oh, that's much better. Abraham. And from here, so these are big gaps, hundreds of years, but this next run, this is father to son, right? So Abraham, Isaac, 2 A's in his name, I don't know why. Jacob. Jacob, by the way, gets his name changed. Anybody? No, not John Jacob Jingleheimer Schmidt. Israel, that's right. So that's the same guy. How many kids does he have? 12. Yeah. The one I'm going to focus on right now is going to be Joseph. Remember Joseph, Technicolor Dreamcoat, all that jazz? So, Garden of Eden, surrounding areas, geography is pretty fuzzy for us. Mount Ararat, but basically the whole world. Abraham makes this journey, right? Splits up the lands he finds with his uncle? No. Abraham lands in the land that God directed him to. He has a son, Isaac. Isaac has Jacob and Esau. And from Jacob comes the 12 tribes of Israel that we think of usually. And there's a little bit of funniness where 2 tribes kind of come from, and then you got Joseph, who there's no tribe named after him. But tell me in brief, if you know the story of Joseph, tell me kind of where it starts and tell me kind of where it ends.
Favorite son, jealousy.
Yep, favorite son, jealousy, sold into slavery, right? Lands in the house of Potiphar, gets falsely accused of sexual harassment, right? Gets kicked out of there, lands in jail, right? Jail where? In Egypt, right? And from there, he interprets some dreams, and he winds up where? Yeah, he's prime minister of Egypt, right? There's the Pharaoh who's king, but then they never use the word prime minister, but hopefully this tracks with us. There's the king, Pharaoh, but then under him, directly under him, and over everything is Joseph. Famine comes to the land, but because of the dreams that God gave to Pharaoh, Egypt is prepared for it. Remember the fat cows, skinny cows, all that kind of stuff? So they've been stockpiling grain for years in preparation for the famine. So not only do they survive the famine well, but Jacob's brothers are not faring well, and they go to seek help from Egypt. And they're reunited with their brother after some shenanigans, right? And so, at the end of Genesis, where are the people of Israel? They all live in Egypt, in what should be an amicable relationship. And you fast forward 400 years, and the Bible describes it as a Pharaoh came up who knew nothing about Jacob, or who knew nothing about Joseph, right? At this point, Israel has grown into a prosperous nation under Egypt, but Egypt is feeling threatened by it. The Pharaoh's feeling threatened. So the treatment of the Hebrews has gotten worse and worse over time to the point where they're now treated as slaves. All that happens between the pages of Genesis and what comes next? Exodus. Did you ever ask yourself, how did the Israelites wind up enslaved to Egypt? Well, it was this. They started off there as friendly allies, and over time, relations were bad, and Pharaoh got more paranoid, and, relations changed over the years, but that's how they wound up in Egypt. So Exodus is the story of... let's go ahead and do that. Moses, and he's leading the people out of Egypt. Where do they go? It was a trap. No, they don't go to the promised land. They go to the wilderness. Yeah. Or that could be wilderness, and that works too. But they're out in the wilderness, right? Moses does not enter the promised land. Who leads them into the promised land? Joshua. So Joshua is kind of the next step. And there's some concurrency going on between Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. There's some concurrency happening there. But the next kind of step in the history is Joshua. So that's into the promised land. All right. And we get the stories of how they face off against all these strongholds and all the local people, and God gives them victory, right, as they're taking over this land and making it their own. If you remember, Joshua was one of the 2 scouts, or one of the 12 scouts that went into the promised land. I hope my memory serves me right. Joshua and Caleb were the 2, So there were 12 spies that went into Canaan back here. And the reports came back. It's full of giants, but it also looks really good. Joshua and Caleb were like, yeah, but we have God, so we can take them. 12 men went to spy on Canaan, 10 were bad, and 2 were good. Maybe y'all had a different Sunday school class than me, but this was a song we sang when I was a kid. All right. So Joshua is a story of getting into the promised land, getting set up. In the wilderness, let's not skip over this. I'm going to write this in caps. We have Moses on Sinai, where he goes to talk to God. Actually, the setup goes something like this. God speaks to the people of Israel, and they freak out. And they say, please don't do that anymore. Can you just talk to one guy? Can you just talk to Moses and let him tell us? So that's how it goes, right? Moses receives all the law, but there's also a covenant that's established. There was a covenant here, the Abrahamic covenant, where God says, I'll make your descendants as numerous as the stars, I'll bless you, you'll bless the nations, all that stuff. There's the Mosaic covenant, which is sort of a renewal of vows between God and his people, in a sense, but also it spells out the terms a little bit more explicitly. Under the Sinai covenant, how were they supposed to choose a king? Again, this question is a trap. God was the king. That was the deal. God said that I will give you judges to help handle the day-to-day running of civil governance. But God was to be their king. And they were supposed to treat him like a king, right? So they would, for instance, they would tithe. That's taxation, right? It wasn't like you tithed because you felt moved to. Everybody was expected to pay their 10%, right? God was the commander-in-chief, right, of the military. Fight the battles that I tell you to. Don't fight the ones that tell you not to, You follow my rules of engagement. God was the leader in all ways, right? And he was the one charged with providing for them. And he gave them the laws, right? So under the Sinai covenant, God was king. Joshua lead them into the promised land. They're doing the thing. There's a lot of battles fought. That sort of kicks off, and it starts with Moses, but the time of the judges, okay? So Moses was the first judge of Israel. People would bring him cases all the time, disputes, whatever, he'd settle them. He'd explain, well, the law says thus, ergo, you're right, you're wrong. Joshua was a judge as well. After him, we get this procession of judges found in the book of star pupil in the front row. Yes, in the book of Judges. And so in that book, you'll get stories like Gideon, and you'll get Deborah, and you'll get Samson, and there's some weird ones in there too. The book of Judges is actually a pretty violent and messy affair. You're not going to hear too many sermon series coming out of the book of Judges. Sometimes you'll have a brave pastor that does that, but it's messy. Well, I'll tell you what, if you made the movie of the book of Judges, it would be solidly rated R. Yeah. So that persists for a while, but as the book of Judges comes to a conclusion, we move on to the book of 1 Samuel. And at this time, Israel's looking around at all the other nations and saying, they've got kings. We want a king. We want a king of our own. And God says, no, you don't. And they say, yeah, we do. And God says, you don't. If you have a king like they have, he's going to take your sons and make them part of his army. He's going to take your daughters and make them work in your house. He's going to take a tenth of all that you own. He's going to treat them the way everybody else treats them. When they're saying to God, we want a king, what they're also saying is, we reject you as our king, right? Because those were the terms. But God says, you know what? Have it your way. I'll give you a king. First king of Israel. Anybody remember? He was a head taller than everybody else. What's up? Yeah, Saul. Now, the book that we call 1 Samuel follows along a prophet, in this case, Samuel. And gives us Saul. Does he work out to be a pretty good king? Not really. They pick him because he's handsome and tall, right? But he's not very faithful to God. I guess you might cut him some slack, being that he's the first king of Israel, and maybe he just doesn't have a good template or something, but he does not do a very nice job. After him, there's this young shepherd boy who gets anointed to be king, but he's not going to become king for a while. His name is David. And it's a wild ride between Saul and David. David faithfully serves Saul, but Saul frequently tries to kill David. David's more popular. He's clearly blessed by God. Saul's paranoid and nervous. David even has opportunities to kill Saul. Like, there's a time where he sneaks in, he cuts off part of Saul's robe just to prove, dude, I could have killed you. David is a man after God's own heart. He serves as king over Israel. Under the reign of David, Israel does well. They win a lot of victories. His heart is for God. But he does have some messy family stuff. He does have some personal weakness involving also infidelity and an indirect murder to cover up that infidelity. If I was making up the Bible, I'd leave that stuff out. I'd be like, no, David was great, but. But he does have a son who comes to rule after him, Solomon. He was, in many ways, the wisest man who ever lived. That seems like maybe that was confined to his professional life, though. Because He marries an unbelievable number of women, and he has a harem with an unbelievable multitude of women, and that leads also to idolatry being tolerated in his house. Can you imagine how messy a family would be if you had several dozen wives? Well, guess what? His family is a mess. When Solomon dies, the kingdom is divided. They can't agree on who's supposed to be king. They split up the kingdom to north and south. North is Israel, south is Judah. Okay? That brings us to the bits of the Bible that many of us don't read hardly at all. So the major and minor prophets are going to happen during this next divided kingdom. What happens to a kingdom divided? Much like a house divided. Yeah, it cannot stand. So something else is happening in the world. Things that have kind of happened throughout history, but they become a more regular occurrence, I think, which is the rise of global or nearly global empires. So one of the world powers that comes is the Assyrian Empire. Let's do it this way. The Assyrian Empire conquers Israel. Judah remains. After that comes the Medo-Persian. I'm just going to call it Persian. Their capital is Babylon, so sometimes you'll hear people talk about the Babylonians. But this is what we're talking about, the Persian Empire. They will conquer Judah. And during this time, so Israel's taken off into exile. They don't get to come home. Judah will be taken off into exile and allowed to come back and taken off again and allowed to come back. So there's sort of this accordion thing going on. After the Persian Empire, guess what? Next come the Greeks, especially Alexander the Great, right? He conquers basically the whole world that he can get his hands on. During the Greek Empire, there's this thing called Hellenization, where they spread Greek culture broadly, and Greek becomes just sort of the global language, much in the same way that English is right now. You know, if you grow up in most parts of the world, you're going to learn the language you learn that they speak there, but also if you learn a second language, probably it's English, right? In America, we don't know what our second language is supposed to be. In Texas, we're like, I guess, Spanish, right? If you live up north, maybe you do French because of Canadians, but it's not as obvious. Well, that was kind of the situation back then. Most of the world was Hellenized. I mean, it was Greekified, right? And so lots of people could speak Greek. It became the common language. What came after the Greek Empire? I heard it. Somebody? The Roman Empire. And that brings us up to the New Testament. The New Testament happens during the Roman Empire. Okay, and then I trust that you know enough from there, or if so, it's out of the scope of what we're going to talk about. To set the scene a little bit, we have Isaiah happens during this time, during the Assyrian Empire. You get Isaiah and a handful of other prophets. During the Persian Empire, you get Jeremiah and a number of other prophets. You also get Esther at this time. Anybody know where Daniel falls on this timeline? So we're going to start near the end here and come to the beginning here. So he lives in a time of a lot of transition. And so we'll get to see that when we get there in the story. I think it's notable, but I'm going to save that for when we get there in the story. All right, so everybody kind of understand where we are in the history of the world, where we are in the history of the Bible. Questions about any of that before we move forward? Here, you mean?
No, I mean within, so like within Judah, there was Jeremiah, Habakkuk, Daniel, and Ezekiel all during the same time.
Those are all prophets, yeah.
Oh,
Those are prophets being called to different messages at different times. Sometimes there's a couple that run concurrently. One's over here, one's over there. Yeah. Yeah, those are all prophets. Okay, cool. I'm just going to assume by your silence that you've taken it all in. Yes?
isn't there a place where Daniel's supposed to be buried? Is there a burial place?
I don't know. I don't know anything about where Daniel might be buried.
The reason I asked, when my son was stationed overseas in the Iraq, Afghanistan area, I remember him sending me a picture saying where Daniel, I think it was Daniel.
So I can't speak to it with any authority. I will say this, though. I wouldn't be surprised if the site of his burial is well recognized. You know, just if you ever go to the Middle East, ever go to the Holy Land, be careful. Just hold it at arm's length when people claim that this is where this is and that is where that is, because oftentimes several people make claims on different sites. Like, well, we think this is the Mount of Olives. Well, we think that's the Mount of Olives. It's like, well, okay, probably it's one of them. I don't know. Do they know exactly where Daniel's buried? Maybe. But there's also been a lot of history between here and there, and who knows. But maybe. I wouldn't be surprised, because as it turns out, Daniel winds up being a pretty important person, not just in the Bible. In a similar way that Joseph was a very important person to Egypt, not just to Israel. Okay? I think this is going to be helpful because if you're used to reading stories about the people of God who are, like shepherds out in the wilderness doing stuff, that's great, but this is not that story. This is a very different kind of story. So I think at half an hour into class, we're going to read our first verse out of the Bible. Does that sound good? All right. Maybe I'll just leave this here so you can reference it. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them into the land of Shinar, not the land of Shinar, which I've been there. This is a different place. To the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Okay, I want to pause there because there's several things that should be noted in this first paragraph. First off, okay, so who's the first main character we're being introduced to? Not really. He's not actually been in the story yet. Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar, right? He's going to feature prominently through a lot of this story. And I think you're going to see that a lot of the book of Daniel, especially the first part, is about God reaching out to Nebuchadnezzar. So keep that in mind as we read. Nebuchadnezzar had waged a campaign against Judah and succeeded, and he pillaged the temple. Remember the temple that Solomon built? He pillaged the temple, took the holy consecrated items out of that temple, and brought them into his own pagan temple. Now, people have tried to do moves like this in the past. You may recall when the Ark of the Covenant was brought into the temple of, I think it was Dagon, and the next day no. This is before Raiders of the Lost Ark, but I think they might have been inspired by this. And so the next morning they wake up and the giant statue of Dagon had fallen down. It was like bowing down, right? Because God was asserting his dominance, and there was a plague also. So again, Spielberg might have been inspired, or was George Lucas and Spielberg? Wow. Okay. Anyways, might have been inspired by those goings-ons, right? So usually in the Bible, when people start stealing stuff from the temple, it's going to go badly. You'll notice in this story, it says that God gave them this stuff. God gave victory to Nebuchadnezzar. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. God's sending a message to the people of Israel if they're paying attention, which is to say, the worship of me has long since ceased where you are. Right? I'm withdrawing for a time. So without calamity coming to him, Nebuchadnezzar has taken these vessels from the temple, brought them into his own pagan temple, and then he does what a lot of smart imperial powers do. He looks for the best and the brightest of the conquered people to add to his cabinet. I'm not going to say it's like America's Got Talent, right? Or like, oh, y'all probably know Star Search, right? Do you remember Star Search? Yeah. But it's like a casting call. He says, I want you to go into these conquered people, find high potential individuals. Did it mention it already? Yeah. So he's looking for royals. He's looking for nobility. So probably on the one hand, because those are going to be well-educated people. Two, they probably know how to conduct themselves in a palace. And maybe they'd be more inclined to understand that what's going on here is just business and not personal. So he sends out his servant to go gather up these talented, wise, competent people so that he can draw from them whatever stuff they've learned. Verse 5, the king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among those there were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. Okay, so what is happening during these 3 years? Somebody just walk me through what we just read. You've got these high potential young men. What's the king doing? He's assimilating them, yeah. And he's doing that in a number of ways. Firstly, he's giving them rich food and wine. So I think there is a process here by which he's getting them comfortable to the new normal. I understand that I conquered your people, but it's not so bad here. It's not so bad here. We eat really good. Like you eat the same things I eat, right? That's a big deal. 3 years of education, what is that education probably meant to do? Because these are already supposed to be the best and the brightest, so why are they getting 3 years of education? What do you think?
They're indoctrinating them.
Yeah, that's right. They're indoctrinating them. So it's sort of like citizenship classes, right? Probably teaching them the language, probably teaching them the customs. Let's be honest, if you're going to spend any time in the presence of the king, one would probably do well to learn what's expected in his presence. So they're getting up to speed with all the Assyrian stuff. And the eunuch changed their names. Why? Yeah. It's probably for the same reason that that the conquered peoples are often exiled, right? When you take people out of their home without their consent, it breaks their spirit a bit, right? It's harder to fight for your home when you're not in your home. Also, he's shaken up their identity, right? He's taken away their Hebrew names and he's given them Assyrian names. And that makes kind of sense. I think, when we read names like Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, those sound weird. Meshach, Abednego, those sound weird. So it's just trading weird for weird. But, well, but, if you were an Assyrian, you'd be trading foreign sounding names for names that sound right. Names that sound local, not barbaric. Just as a little side note, I think it's really interesting that when we think about the four characters, you think of who in the lion's den? Daniel in the lion's den. Who do you think about in the fiery furnace? Don't you mean Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah? Fascinating to me. We know Daniel by his Hebrew name, but we know the other three by their Assyrian names. Okay. Let's get into the story a little bit. So you have the setup, and so far our main character hasn't done anything yet. So now let's go ahead and read kind of his introduction into the story. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's blood or with the wine, with the king's blood, the king's food, or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him to not defile himself. What do you mean defile yourself? He's just offering you food. So it's left implicit in the story. I read a number of commentaries. They all seem to agree, and my intuition goes this direction too. So probably any of the food that they would have offered would have been first offered as sacrifice to whatever the pagan gods are, right? When you read later on in Corinthians about eating the meat that is sacrificed to idols, it's the same situation. Sacrifice is a big deal, and I'm going to put you on the spot. How many of you, by show of hands, how many of you say grace before you eat? Yeah, I do. The idea of sacrificing an animal to the god before you then cook it and eat it, it's not that different an idea. When we think about sacrificing animals to God, probably because we're just not used to it, I think a lot of us just imagine, well, you just kill it and then you just burn the whole thing. But no, that's not usually how it happened. Usually, it was killed. Maybe a portion of it was burned, maybe. But it was sort of killed in the presence of the god and then, offered up. But then the people actually cook it and eat it. So a very good chance that that's the case here with the wine, with the meat that's being offered, is that they would have first been sacrificed. Like, why let a perfectly good sacrifice not be sacrificed? We could still eat it, Might as well appease God and then eat it. So Daniel says, I don't want to be part of that. And God gave Daniel favor, verse 9. God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. All right, so what's the concern of the eunuch here? Yeah, going to get all sickly and skinny, all right? Yeah, I mean, the king has charged this eunuch with making sure that all these young men are healthy, fit, and, ready to serve. And look, this eunuch knows what happens when you go vegan. He wants you to go keto, man. No, I mean, but his concern is, well, if you're not eating properly, you're just going to get all sickly, and then I'm going to be in trouble. The king's going to be like, why aren't you feeding these guys? So then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were in better appearance and fatter in flesh than all. I don't think that's an indictment. And fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. All right, so interestingly, long before the Enlightenment, we still have Daniel having them run a clinical trial, including a control group, right? Give us the weird diet, give them the prescribed diet, they'll be the control group, and let's just see who looks better at the end of it. Now, it's clear that at the end of 10 days, who was looking the best? Yeah, the 4 Hebrews that weren't eating the meat sacrificed to idols. Do you think that the Bible is saying a simple vegetarian diet is the healthiest way to live? No, he's not. As a matter of fact, permission to eat meat was given by God to Noah. Nowhere in the Bible does God ever say, the vegetarian lifestyle is the one that I desire for you. I don't think what's going on here in their bodies has much to do with the material diet, the incoming calories and carbs and all that stuff. I think it has everything to do with God blessing a choice for holiness. Now, I do kind of wonder, see, after this experiment runs, what does the eunuch decide? He's going to let them stay on the diet, but what else? They're doing it to everybody else. Now, let's just say that you're some other guy who's been enjoying the rich food and the wine, and then one day the eunuch comes by and says, yeah, these guys look a lot better than you. We're going to put you on veggies and water. How would you be feeling? How would you be feeling about Daniel? Yeah. This will go understated, but I think the seeds of something might be happening right here. So we'll put a pin in that for the future. Let's keep going. I'm going to get to the end of the chapter, and then we're going to call it a day. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Take note of that. It'll come up next chapter. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So it probably wasn't the diet, right? Because everybody's on the same diet. Therefore, they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king had inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. That's foreshadowing. I'll give you a hint. Cyrus is not an Assyrian name. Cliffhanger. Okay, we'll leave that there for now. Next week we'll pick up chapter 2. And as we get a little deeper into this stuff, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how all of this butts up against what it's like to be in a culture that's maybe not so welcoming to your faith, and what the proper way for a Christian to move forward is. So we'll be reading with an eye toward that as we get deeper into the book. But for now, thank you. And we got church coming up in about 11 minutes, so stick around.